Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another chapter of Experiencer Interviews. And today we're lucky to have on Steve Boucher, a very good friend of mine. Steve, thanks for coming on. Really glad to see you again. Haven't seen you since last year. So hope you enjoyed the quarantine.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm doing okay with the quarantine. I'm by myself most of the time anyway, so it hasn't been a real big stumbling block for me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I started working perhaps a month ago. So yeah, it was starting to get a bit boring back home. Luckily, I was able to work still, but yeah, I'm really glad to be back. So we met in 2017, I believe. Well, we were friends on Facebook before that because Grant did, I think, an interview with you, and I found you out on Facebook. Then we started, chatting, and then we finally met up at the Toronto convention, I believe.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
Yeah, I think I met Kevin Estrella from Pyramids on Mars that same year. Yeah, because we went to the three of us to a restaurant, and that's where you did that infamous Skinny Bob drawing, which we really freaked out the waitress at the time. That was funny. I need to share this on during this video because Kevin really freaked out the waitress by telling her that all three of us were abductees. So so yeah, I'm sad that we never kept that drawing because that really needed to be in a portrait somewhere on a wall because that's gold, man.
Well, the waitress probably took it home with her. We'd
have to ask.
Yeah.
So Steve, coming to your getting to your story, now you've I know that you were a child experiencer abductee contactee, but you also thanks to regression later on you've had pre-incarnation memories come up. Can you get into that?
Yeah. I had some pre-birth memories. What happened was I was on my lunch hour one day. I was working at a hardware store in between drafting jobs, and I was sitting in my van out in the parking lot eating my lunch, reading a book. It's a book of Gnostic stuff, the Nag Hammadi Library. It's a big, thick book. And I happened to stumble on something in the middle of it. I wish I had kept a bookmark in it so I could go back to that because I haven't been able to find it again since. But it was a description of a high place where the person that wrote the book said they could see the earth from a high place. And all of a sudden it was like a floodgate opened in my brain and all these pre-birth memories came out because that resonated with me. I remembered that. I remembered standing like in a similar situation where I was standing what appeared to be on the edge of a crater, which I suspect was on the moon because of the size, I could see the earth out in space hanging there like a big beach ball. It would have been somewhere close to Earth, like the moon. So I figured that's where I was at this high place. And there was a gray alien standing next to me. And I remembered his name was something like Rigel, I thought. And I respected him a lot. I knew him fairly well, and I respected him because he was like an officer. He had some kind of authority, kind of like the way we would respect a police officer or a soldier or something. And he had like a title and some kind of authority. And he was telling me that I had to go down to Earth. And I remember I was terrified. I didn't want to go. And he said, why are you so afraid to go? And I said, because I've heard a lot of things about Earth that are frightening and I don't want to go down there. And I'd heard a lot of horrible things about the place. And so he told me, he argued with me for a while. He said, well, you have to go because the council has proclaimed it, that you have to go down there. And I tried to argue my way out of it, and I couldn't seem to make any headway with him. And I said, well, I just don't want to go down there. And he said, well, there's a guy that, a soul that has come back from a life on Earth. And maybe if you talk to him, it'll make you feel better about it. So I said, okay. And then it was like instantly I was transported into this room. It was a room with no furniture, no windows, but it was fairly dimly lit, you know, kind of like when the sun goes down. And there was a guy sitting in the middle of the room on a chair. There was only one chair. That was the only furniture in the room. And he was sort of hunched over and he looked pretty depressed. And I went up to him and I said, I understand that you just came back from Earth. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, how was it? And he said, well, I'm probably not the best person to answer, but he said, it was good. Some parts were good and some were bad. And I said, well, was it more good than bad or more bad than good? And he said, well, I'm not really the best person to answer. And I said, well, if you had to go back, would you go back? And he said, well, that's the problem. He said, I do have to go back. And I said, why? And he said, because I didn't complete my mission. And when he told me that, I got the distinct sensation that he had committed suicide. And he was now sitting in this room feeling the weight of what he'd done, you know. And so I backed away from him, and I was immediately back on this ridge with Rigel, the gray alien, standing next to me. And he said, did you talk to him? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, did he make you feel better about going? And I said, no. You know, he made me feel worse about going. And so Rigel told me, he says, well, you have to go because, you know, it's been decreed that you have to go down there. And he made me feel like I had no way out of it. And I felt trapped, like that I had to do this thing, and I really didn't want to do it. And he said, I said, well, if I go down there, will you come and check on me every now and then and make sure I'm okay? And he said, well, we don't usually like to do that, but if you'll go down there, I'll do that. And what I didn't realize was that at that point, I had made a contract with him and it was a conditional contract that I would go to Earth if he would come and check on me every now and then. And, you know, some people that have been abducted by Greys ask themselves, why me? And when I remembered this memory, it answered that question for me, because he was the leader in most of the abductions that I had throughout the early part of my life. And he did come and check on me. He kept his end of the bargain. And at one place where I lived in Owen Sound, he actually came to visit me. But that's kind of like my second experience.
So Rigel would be the blue suited gray that you sent me, the image?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so I guess that, oh yeah, before we get into your next event, when you were describing that you were looking at Earth from orbit, let's say from on the moon,
right?
Back in 2012, I used to meditate a lot for the planet and send energy to the planet, try to
Mm-hmm.
heal. It's the with my energy, and I had a dream, and this was really really real. I was probably on the moon. My mother and I were looking downwards toward Earth, and a man that appeared to be my father, but I knew it wasn't my father, but but looked as if it was him, but
Yep.
the energy was off.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother and I were happy because we were going to Earth. Like we had something to do and we agreed to it. So
Yeah.
your memory really triggered that. And the way I was seeing Earth is as if we had clotheslines on the moon, and I had like bed sheets, white bed sheets, drapes, attached it, and when and the wind was moving, and when in between like blows, I get a glimpse of the Earth, and I'd see it, and that's how I realized, oh my God, I'm in space. So I was looking down toward Earth, and my mother and I were happy because we agreed to go down to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't really happen, but it really it seemed a lot like what happened to you in a sense. So
Yeah. Well, when I thought of this high place, and I read that there was such a place, a high place in the Nag Hammadi Library, I immediately thought that this was the place mentioned in the Bible where Satan took Jesus up to a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of the earth. And I got chills up my spine when I thought of that this place actually exists, and that would have been the perfect vantage point to see all the kingdoms of the earth, because you're above it and you can watch it rotate, and you would actually see the entire earth from that vantage point. So I think that was the place mentioned in the Bible.
wow.
Yeah.
Did your okay, so now we've established that you've got something happened before incarnating. So
Mm-hmm.
when was your first experience or first event that told you something was going on?
Okay, well, the first event was when I was about 2 years old, and I had this little metal cart. Like, there wasn't much plastic around back at that time. Everything was made of metal, and I was in this little metal cart that surrounded me. I could sit in it, and it had a metal tray on the front of it, and it had wheels, so I could my mother used to put me outside in this thing, and she could see me from the back door of the apartment we lived in at that time. And I'd walk around on this kind of a dirt road on this thing, and I had a puppy under my arm that I used to take with me on these little trips where I'd voyage out sometimes. And I was outside, and I heard a voice calling me. And I turned and looked at the door, and it wasn't my mother. And I thought, where's this voice coming from? And they said, over here, come over here. And I said, where are you? And they said, we're behind these bushes. And there were like a bunch of trees and bushes kind of in the neighbor's yard. And there was no fence between our yards, so I could go over there. And so I started wheeling myself across the grass to get there, and it was kind of awkward to move this thing because I was used to wheeling it around on the road, and the grass kind of was a different texture, and it wasn't easy to move it. But I managed to get around the side of the bushes, and when I got around the side of the bushes, there was a saucer-shaped craft sitting on the ground, and there were two beings standing outside, and they were looking at me. And I heard them in my head. The one being said, we've been waiting for you. And he walked over to me, and he picked me up and lifted me out of this little metal cart, and he took me inside the ship. And the other being followed him in, and there were two gurney-like things inside there, and he laid me down on one, and the other being laid down on the other one. And then they started to, they had all kinds of equipment in there, like screens and things, and they had wires that they put on me. And I said, I couldn't move, you know, and I said, I want to go home. And he said, it's okay. He says, we're not going to hurt you. And I said, why am I here? And he said, well, we're going to take a part of you, my friend is going to get, and you're going to get part of him. And that made me even feel more panicky. And I said, no, I want to keep all my parts. I don't want you to take any parts from me. And I was upset because I physically thought he was going to like cut my arm off or something, you know. And he said, no, we're not going to hurt you. It's okay. And they kept me there for a few minutes, and they had this equipment running. And then when this procedure was done, he said, okay, we're finished now, and you can go home. So he picked me up and he took me off the gurney thing and took me back to my little cart, and he put me in it. I don't know how long I was gone, maybe 15 or 20 minutes or so, it felt like. And so I could hear my mother calling me, and I left them and I went around the side of the bushes. And as soon as she saw me, she had her hands on her hips and she was waving her finger at me and saying, where were you? She said, I told you not to go anywhere where I can't see you. You stay in the back here so I can see where you are from the door. Where were you? And I said, well, I was just around the corner behind the bushes there. And so she came and got me, and she said, if you do that again, I'll take the fly swatter to you. And I was terrified of the dreaded fly swatter, you know, because whenever I was bad, she'd give me a whack with this fly swatter and it stung. And so anyway, she brought me in the house and she took me into the living room and sat me down on the floor. And I had some building blocks there that back in those days that they were like wooden building blocks, about 2 inches high by 2 inches wide by 2 inches deep. And they had letters and numbers on them. And it was to help little kids learn the alphabet and learn how to count and stuff like that. So I was stacking these wooden blocks, and I heard the voice call me again. And they must have made me forget about the first time, you know, because it was like I didn't put it together that this was the same beings. And I said, where are you? And they said, climb up on the couch and look out the window. And there was a window there above the couch. And so I climbed up on the back of the couch and I stuck my head into the window and I was looking out, and they said, look up in the sky. And so I looked up and I saw this bright light just zoom across the sky really fast. And I said, wow. I said, was that you? And they said, yes. And I said, can you do it again? And they said, yes, we'll do it again. And so he said, I'll tell you when to look. And I said, okay. And then he said, all right, look now. And I looked up and I saw it again, zoom across the sky, this bright white light. And I said, if you're up there, how come I can hear you? And he said, because we can see what you see and we can hear what you hear. And so I believe that they had given me an implant in the ship that allowed them to see what I could see and hear what I could hear from a distance. Like it was like telepathy amplified, kind of, you know, and they could speak to me from high up above the earth, you know. And so I said, what's your name? And he said, well, you can call me the commander. And I said, okay. And that was a big word for me at the time. But anyway, I said, well, what do you look like? And he said, well, I'll show you what I look like. And I said, are you going to come here? And he said, no, not today, but I'll show you what we look like. And so he said, look over between the door and the chair in the living room. So I looked into this spot where the door was, and to the left of it where the chair was, and I saw this being materializing, and it looked like a gray being, like what we would know as a gray being. And I said, is that you? And he said, yes. And so I was really excited when I saw this thing materializing there. It was like a hologram, you know. And then he disappeared. And he said, I said, when can I see you? And he said, well, we'll be coming back. He said, you'll see us again. And so I got down off the couch, and I was running into the kitchen to tell my mother. And there was a vacuum cleaner. She'd been vacuuming, and the hose was across where the doorway was, and I tripped on it and fell, and I skinned my knee, and it was bleeding. And so I went in, I was crying, and she put a Band-Aid on it for me. And so that was where that incident ended.
So this happened when you were about 2 years old, 3 years old, perhaps?
Somewhere between 2 and 3.
2 and 3, okay.
I think closer to 2, but my mother, she thinks it was more closer to 3 because of the conversation that we had. She said, you wouldn't understand that if you were only 2. Yeah. And I said, well, I think I would, because when I would communicate with you, I could only point at what I wanted and make sounds like, and there wasn't much in the way of communication there. But I said, you have to remember that these beings are telepathic, and they can see what I'm feeling inside, and they can communicate with very young children that haven't even been able to speak yet. They haven't learned to speak properly yet, and they'll know what that person wants and what they're thinking, because there's no words getting in the way. They can see right into your thoughts. So I was able to communicate with them better than I could talk to my own mother at 2 years old.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess your next event happened when you were approximately 4 years of age. You were on the road, I believe.
Well, there's 2 events that happened when I was around 4.
Okay.
And the one incident was the incident with my dad. The other incident was after we moved and we were renting a house in Owen Sound, and the being came right into my bedroom one day, and he started to talk to me, and he asked me how I'm doing, and I looked at him, and I could see that he was different. There's something unusual about him, and I was trying to figure it out because I kept seeing these big black eyes, and that's the part that stood out to me. And he asked me how I was doing, and I said, I'm doing okay. And he walked over and he sat down in the corner of my room, and I came over to him and I said, who are you? And he said, I'm the commander. And when he said that, I remembered, oh, you're the guy that was speaking to me in my mind. And he said, yes. And I kept studying his face and seeing these big black eyes. And I said, are you a gollywog? And he looked at me and he said, what's a gollywog? And my mother had bought me these children's books, and one of them was about this mythological being that was like a little being with a black face and big white eyes. And probably those books today would not be considered to to be appropriate. They might seem racist today, but back in those days, it wasn't so. And I used to enjoy reading the books about this little gollywog creature. So I brought the book over and I showed it to him. And he had this gray face with these big black eyes. And the gollywog had a black face with big white eyes. And he said, look at the gollywog. And I looked at it. And he said, now look at me. And he said, do I look like that? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, then I guess I'm not a gollywog.
I never heard that story before.
Yeah. Well, some of them, like these stories are in my book.
Okay.
But I haven't told them in public before, some of them. So this is a first.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
And then the next experience was the one with my dad.
Okay. Let's get into that one.
Yeah. And I believe this one happened on Owen Sound as well. And we were coming back from somewhere at night. My mother wasn't with us. She was at home, and I was with my dad. And back in those days, the cars had a kind of a shelf behind the back seat. And the window kind of sloped down over this shelf. And I was small enough that I could climb up there and lay down on the shelf and look up through the window at the stars. And so I was doing that. I was looking up at the stars, and I noticed that one of them was moving. And I almost felt like it was speaking to me. And it seemed to be getting closer and closer, and it was getting bigger and bigger. And so at one point, I climbed down off the shelf, and I climbed over into the front seat and sat in the passenger seat next to my dad. And this light came over the trees, and it was matching our speed at treetop level. And my dad hadn't noticed it yet. And I said, what is that light out there? And he said, what light? And I said, that light. And he looked, and when he saw the thing, he went into instant panic. He floored the gas pedal, and he tried to outrun it, but you can't outrun those beings, And so I said, what is it? And he said, shut up, leave me alone. And he never usually talks to me like that. So it felt like I could sense something was wrong, like he was afraid. And I wasn't used to seeing him afraid. But he said he was trying to outrun it, and it took off ahead of us, and it came down in the middle of the road. And there were what I think were pine trees on both sides. And when it came down in the road, it lit up all the pine trees, and it lit up the entire road. And we had to stop because, we couldn't keep going. And I don't know if the engine stalled on us at that point or if we just physically decided to stop. But we stopped, and we were in the middle of the road looking straight at this thing. And my dad looked at me, and he said, I want you to stay low. He said, so they don't see you. He said, stay low. And he said, under no circumstances get out of the car. You stay in the car and don't let them see you. Don't look over the dashboard. Just stay here. He said, I'm going to go and find out what they want. And he said, you stay in the car. Don't you get out. And so he got out, and he started. There were two beings in the road by that time, and he was walking over to them. And I couldn't resist looking. I was looking over the dashboard at them, but I was trying to stay low. And I saw my dad go over and start talking to the one being. And in retrospect, I think these were probably the same two beings that abducted me, when I was 2. And so I could see my dad talking to them, and I was curious, and I kept straining my neck to see who these beings were and if I knew them, you know. And you can get away with a lot when you're 4 years old, you know. And even though he told me to stay in the car, I couldn't resist it. I got out through the driver's door, and I walked over to where my dad was, and he had his back to me, and he put his hand behind his back, and he was making this motion with his hand for me to go back. And but I wasn't listening to him, and I walked up behind him, and he was shielding me so that the being couldn't see me. But the other being had full view of me. He was standing right there, you know. And so the being that was talking to my dad, he just suddenly went like that, looked over his shoulder, and he saw me, and he said to my dad, "You seem to be concerned about the child." And I heard him in my mind. And my dad kind of laughed sheepishly, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "that's my boy." And then he turned to me and he said, "I told you to stay in the car. Now you go back and get in the car and you stay there." And I said, "But I want to see, you know." And so the being, he said to my dad, "Would you like my crew member here to take him back to the vehicle for you?" And my dad said, "No." He said, "That's okay. We have to get going. My wife's waiting for me at home." And so the being looked at the other being, and he immediately walked over to me, took me by the hand, and started walking me back to the car. And my dad was just standing there in the middle of the road looking back at us. And I could see he was not comfortable with that idea at all, you know. But I got into the car, and the being got in beside me and sat in the driver's seat and shut the door. And my dad was standing there with the other being, just looking at us. And the being that was with me, he grabbed the steering wheel and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Oh, that makes the car go this way or that way, whichever way you turn it." And he said, "Oh, I see." And he pointed to the pedals on the floor and he said, "And what do they do?" And I said, "Well, one makes the car go and the other makes it stop." And at that point, I glanced up and I noticed that my dad and the other being weren't there anymore. So I assumed that they had gone onto the craft. And so then the being that was with me pointed at the dashboard at the radio, and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that's a radio." And he said, "How does it work?" And I said, "Well, you hear people talking on it, and you can hear music." And he said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Can you talk back to them on it?" And I said, "No, it doesn't work that way. You can only listen to it." And he said, "Oh, okay." And he was keeping me busy. He asked me how the car gets started. And I said, "Well, you have to put a key in it and turn it." And he said, "Do you have the key?" And I said, "No, my dad has it." And he says, "Oh, I see." And he asked me, he said, "What do you do during the day? Do you go to school?" And I said, "No, uh, I'll be going to school next year." So that's how I knew I was 4,
Okay.
because I would have started school at 5. And so he kept me busy asking me questions, and I was enjoying his company because he was paying attention to me. And you know, a lot of times when you're a little kid, nobody pays attention to you, and you know, so I was enjoying his company. And I guess he kept me busy for about 20 minutes or so. And then I saw my dad come back out with the other being. And then he looked at me and he said, "I have to go now." And I said, "Can't you stay just a little bit longer?" And he said, "Well, maybe for a minute." And then I saw the other being nod his head like that. And he said, "Now I do have to go." And so he got out and he passed my dad in the road. My dad was coming back to the car. He passed him, and my dad got in, and we watched the two beings go back into the ship, and the ship lifted off the road and started going back over the trees. And my dad, he was very quiet. He didn't say too much, you know, and he started the car and we started heading for home. And then something unexpected happened. They came back again a second time and they did the exact same thing. They went down the road in front of us and landed. And I remember my dad seeing this, saying, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" And then the one being came over to the window, and in those days, you had to lower the window with a crank. You know, there was no electric windows, and the being motioned for him to lower the window, and he lowered the window, and he said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these," and he handed him his glasses. And so my dad thanked him, and he went back to the ship, and they left, and that was the end of the incident.
Wow. How did your dad feel about this? Did you ever, talk about the event later on in life?
No, we didn't talk about it at all. We never discussed it until I started getting the memories of these things coming back after I read Budd Hopkins' book Missing Time. And so when I started getting these fragments of memory, I wasn't sure if this was a dream I was remembering or what. But when I got to the end of the book, there was a paragraph that said, if you feel that you've had an experience similar to any of the experiences mentioned in this book, and you'd like to have them investigated, you can write to Budd Hopkins at this address. And so I thought of writing him a letter, but then I thought, well, what if it is all a dream? So at that point, that's when I decided to ask my dad if he remembered this. And so I went into the living room and he was reading his paper on the couch. And I said, "I need to talk to you for a minute." And he put the paper down and I told him what I remembered of the experience of him being taken on board the ship and the being sitting with me. And he remembered when I mentioned the part about him putting his hand behind his back and motioning for me to get back in the car. That triggered his memory. He remembered that. He said, "Yes, I remember doing that." And when we both remembered, and he corroborated everything I'd remembered up to that point, except the part about them giving his glasses, because I hadn't remembered that part at that time. And that came later. But up to then, he remembered everything that I remembered. And that told me that the incident had to be real. Either that or we were having like a shared hallucination. And so I decided to write to Budd Hopkins, and I wrote to him. And about a week later, he phoned my house. Really? And got my mother on the phone, and he explained who he was and why he was calling. And then she called me. She said, "Steve, Budd Hopkins is on the phone." And I was shocked. I couldn't believe that he actually phoned me from New York, you know. So I went and talked to him, and he said he believed that I may have had, and my dad, we may have had a UFO experience with aliens. And he said, "I would like for both of you to come to New York, and you can stay at my studio in Manhattan. It's a fully furnished apartment studio." And my dad wouldn't go because he had to work, you know, he couldn't leave his job. But I had a week holiday coming up and vacation. And so I decided to go. And I went to New York, and to make a long story short, I had 2 hypnosis sessions with Dr. Clamar that did the sessions in his book Missing Time, and Budd did the 3rd one. And so there was a group.
Want to get into the photos you sent me?
Yeah, you can show those if you want.
Okay. Now, you've got one with Budd and his friend. Was he an abductee as well?
If he was, he didn't tell me.
Okay.
but he was a good friend of Budd, and Budd had some encounters of his own. And he doesn't, at that time, he wasn't telling anybody about them because there was a clear distinction there that he wanted to maintain between an abductee and an investigator. And he went the route of being the investigator. So he didn't want to reveal his experiences.
Now, the two images about the gathering, were all of you over there for getting also to get regressions done?
Well, these people that Bud introduced me to, he had like a little party in his studio the day I was leaving, and he got pizza and pop and stuff, and we all sat around. He introduced me to these other abductees that he'd been working with, and he said, "This is all there is of the abductees." There was only like about well, three of them, the two girls and a guy, and there was Ted Blocher and Budd Hopkins and myself. And so we had this little party, and we talked about our experiences and shared them, and so it was interesting. I didn't expect that he would give me like a bit of a send off like that. You know, it was kind of nice.
At what age did this happen? That the year that had this happened.
Well, the year it happened was 1981, where I went to New York, and I stayed in his studio in Manhattan.
Okay.
And it was an interesting time while I was there. He told me, well, Ted told me when he gave me the key, he said, "Don't go out at night. And if you do have to go out for something at the store, go straight to the store. Don't make eye contact with anybody. And when you come back, go in and lock the door."
Whoa.
And he made me feel like this was kind of a seedy part of Manhattan, or part of Manhattan that it wasn't a very good area, you know. And so the one day I went out and I bought a 6-pack at the store there, and when I came back, I noticed there was an older gentleman in a wheelchair that was painted fluorescent green, and there was a pool hall on the corner, and he was talking to a guy in the doorway of the pool hall, a big burly guy, and they seemed to be having an argument about something. And I just kind of noticed this as I went into the apartment, and I locked the door. And the next morning, I decided to go out and see if I could find a restaurant to have breakfast. And so I went out and I walked down to where the pool hall was, across the street, and I walked up the street to find a restaurant. And I got to see the dark side of Manhattan. And there was vomit in all the doorways of the stores and buildings and stuff. And some of them were blankets that were covered with vomit. And there were people that were sleeping in the doorways, like a lot of homeless people. And as I walked up the street, I started finding pieces of this fluorescent green wheelchair. Like there was, one of the wheels was on the ground. And I walked up further, and I found another wheel, and then the handles and stuff like that. They were all laying there in pieces on the ground. And when I came upon the last piece, there was like a little indentation of a parking lot with a big industrial garbage bin sitting there. And I looked at this piece of the wheelchair, and I looked at the garbage bin, and I didn't want to look in there. I just said, "No, I'm not going to look in there." I was afraid of what I'd see, you know. So I found a restaurant, and I had breakfast, and I went back. You know.
How many total regressions were done while you were there at Budd's?
Well, Dr. Aphrodite Clamar did 2 of them, And that's when I started remembering pieces of the van incident, which is the incident with my band, where the band was abducted. And the third one that he had scheduled for me, Dr. Clamar was sick that day, but Bud had a key to get in, and she told him that he could use the studio in her office and do the regression himself. So he did the regression himself. And the first two that she did, I recorded, and or we recorded them on cassette. So I had the tapes. The third one, they tried to record it, but the microphone wasn't placed in the right position, and they couldn't hear me. All you could hear was just some muffled sounds. And so it didn't turn out at all. But I wrote the transcripts out later of the two cassettes from the first two sessions that she had done with me. And they're in my book.
Okay, awesome. The image regarding when you're coming out of hypnosis, that was done in Toronto?
Yeah, that was after I met up with Q4 at the UFO Symposium in Toronto. And there was a couple of people there. Michael Moore was there. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And J. Allen Hynek was speaking it. And I saw J. Allen Hynek. He was just standing across the room from me talking to another guy, and he had the pipe in his hand that he was notorious for. And I kind of wished I had shaken hands with him and introduced myself now, but because he passed away shortly after that. You know?
Wow. You're lucky to to have the chance to see the guy, because a lot of people, like, I would have felt blessed to shake his hand, but again.
So Bud had told me to, he said, if you want your case to be investigated further, contact MUFON. So I was looking at looking for a guy named David Hazel that wrote a book. I think it's called The Missing 7 Hours. And he was speaking there. And I was looking for him, and I found this other guy that I thought was him. And I started talking to him, and I ended up blurting out my story to him. And he was listening very intently. And it turned out that he was a member of QFORN. And he took me to meet these guys at QFORN, the directors. They contacted me, and so I went to the studio of Harry Tokars. He was one of the guys. And they brought a reporter in from the Toronto Sun, which I was very uncomfortable because I wanted to keep my name quiet. I wanted to remain anonymous. I didn't want my name to get out. And I was worried about him being there, but they assured me that he wasn't going to publish anything, that he was there just because he was very interested in the subject. And if it eventually developed into a story, he wanted to be able to have the information. But they assured me that he wouldn't publish anything without my permission. So I agreed. And they interviewed me for about 8 hours. You know, they just kept asking me all kinds of questions and stuff. And they put me through a thorough grilling, you know. And then they started coming to St. Catharines to meet my dad and stuff like that. They met all the members of the band that were around at that time, and interviewed them all. And the guitarist, which I called Tom, and it's a pseudonym, him and his girlfriend, Anne-Marie, went to Toronto, and they went under hypnosis at the request of the directors of QFORN to see what they recalled. And well, Anne-Marie didn't go under hypnosis, but the guitarist did. And he didn't remember much because he actually stayed in the van with Anne-Marie when the incident happened. He didn't go on the ship. So he didn't really recall that much, but he said he recalled seeing some lights on the road, thinking it was an accident, and he remembered pulling over.
So your band name was Harmony Grove?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
now we've, the photo that I've got you and 3 other members. So the band was
Yeah.
larger than the photo.
Well, one of the members in that picture, the bass player, is not the original bass player that was with us during the abduction.
Okay.
He left the band and was replaced by this other guy, but all the other members are the original members.
Okay.
There's 3 of us.
At what year did this abduction take place?
That was around 1971, I believe. And Q-Forn found that out because when they interviewed the guitarist, they found out that he kept a logbook of all the gigs that we played. And so they asked him to bring out the logbook, and they tracked the date down. And it was sometime in October of 1971 that we were abducted.
Okay. So that was the gig that was at the restaurant near Lake Superior?
Near Lake Ontario.
Lake Ontario, yeah, okay.
Yeah. The ship, we were trying to get on the highway to come back to St. Catharines, and we had a hitchhiker with us, a guy that we picked up at the party that wanted a ride to St. Catharines. And he was a young guy like us with long hair and a blue jean jacket. And so we let him come with us, even though he was pretty drunk. He'd been sitting there drinking the whole time. And apparently he was supposed to meet a friend there that was going to give him a ride home if he showed up. And his friend never showed up. So he needed a lift back to St. Catharines. And so we gave him a lift. And it turned out that he turned out to be the guy that opened the door and let the beings in during the abduction. He was, when we saw this ship in the road, it was there were lights around it, red lights around the perimeter. And I remembered blue lights, kind of like little searchlights on the bottom of it that were kind of panning back and forth over the pavement. And the guitarist, he was driving the van, and he stopped the van and he said, you guys better take a look at this because you aren't going to believe me. And so we looked over the seat and we saw the ship sitting there in the parking lot of this restaurant that it's on the south shore of Lake Ontario. It overlooks the lake. And this would have been around 4 in the morning, I figured, 4 a.m. And he said, what do you think it is? And I said, I don't know, maybe it's a movie prop or something like that. And they said, well, why would they be making a movie at 4 in the morning? And I said, well, I don't know. And it was clear to us that it was a flying saucer shaped object. And so we decided that we were going to go back and take the back road back to St. Catharines instead of the surface road, this service road, because the entrance to the highway was closed. That's how we ended up on the service road. And so we decided that the best thing to do was turn back, because none of us really wanted to find out what it was, or, and so he started to, what I thought he was going to do was turn around, make a U-turn to go back. But instead, we started heading toward it. And I said, what are you doing? I said, I thought you were going to turn. And he said, well, I am trying to turn. He said, look, he says, I've got the steering wheel cranked over all the way and nothing's happening. We're going straight toward this thing. And I said, well, put on the brake. And he says, I'm trying to, and he's pumping the brake with his foot. And I realized at that point that I couldn't feel the normal bumps that you would feel in the road when you're driving. We were just kind of floating smoothly toward this thing. And we were going so fast toward it that I was bracing myself for impact because I thought we were going to hit it.
Wow.
And so we stopped about 30 feet away from it. And the van just slowed and stopped and came to rest on the road. And by this time, we were all in sheer panic. Everybody's yelling and talking all at once, and we're all panicking. And the drummer, he was sitting in the passenger seat, and he turned around and he said, "Everybody just shut up." And so we all went quiet, and he became the voice of reason. And he said, if we just be quiet and we stay low and we don't move, just make it look like the van is empty, and maybe they'll leave us alone. And so we all decided that his plan was about the best we had at the time. So we all stayed really quiet, and we just waited. And then I heard him say, "Oh no." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "They're coming out." And I said, "I want to see." And he said, "No, stay down, stay low." And I said, "Well, what do they look like?" And he said, "Well, they're just little guys." And they came over to the van and they were trying the doors. We could hear the doors that they were trying to get in. And the hitchhiker had been kind of quiet through all this. And he was sitting in the corner in the back. And he, all of a sudden, he just started looking around. And I don't want to miss the part where we saw a head go by the window, just kind of floated by. And I said, "Did you see that?" And everybody went, "Shh," you know. And Anne-Marie, she said, "I saw it." And then that's when the hitchhiker started looking around, and he just reached over and he grabbed the handle on the back door and pulled on it and opened the door, and he just pushed it open. And as soon as he did that, we were shocked that he would do that. And we wondered, why would he do such a thing? You know, so I grabbed the mic stand because I thought, if we get into a skirmish with these things, I don't know what they are, and I want to have something to use as a weapon. And as soon as the door opened, there were 3 of them, and they were standing in a lineup. And the being in front immediately came up into the van, and he walked in, and they were short enough that he was standing up full height, and there was about 6 inches between the top of his head and the top of the van. And we couldn't stand up in that, like, you know. So he was looking around at us, and I was trying to move, and I couldn't move. And I heard him in my head. He looked around. He said, "I'm sorry, but we had to paralyze you temporarily because you were thinking thoughts of violence." And he said, "I was concerned about the safety of myself and my crew members." And he said, we don't want to hurt you. We're not here to harm you. We're on a peaceful mission." And he said, "We just want to run some tests on you, and then you can be on your way." And he said, "I'm going to select 3 of you." And he looked at our bass player, and he said, "I would like you." And then he looked at the hitchhiker, and he said, "And you." And then he looked at me, and he said, and I could see as soon as he stared at me, I looked down at the ground. I didn't want to look at his eyes, because that's how you can hear them, through their eyes. Their lips don't move. I don't think they even have a movable mandible for a jaw. It's just, you know. And I was staring at the floor of the van. I didn't want to look up at him, but the tension was getting so tense that I finally looked up at him, and he was staring right at me, and he said, "And you." And so he said, "Would you follow me, please?" and he turned around and he was leaving the van, and we knew we had to follow him. We weren't paralyzed anymore, and the fear had subsided when he assured us he wasn't going to hurt us or anything. And the hitchhiker got out, and then the being, his foot got caught in the snare drum stand, and the drum fell over and it rolled out the back of the van, and immediately one of the other beings picked it up and started looking at it. And so I got out and I took my bag of recorders with me. I wasn't going to leave them behind. And as soon as I got out, I was face to face with this being that had the drum. And I remember this thought in my head, like, oh my God, are you ever ugly? And the being immediately turned his head away from me so I wouldn't have to see his face. And then I felt really embarrassed because I was wondering, like, he obviously heard my thought. And then I started wondering, was that me thinking that about him, or was it him thinking that about me? You know? And so I got out, and the leader, the one that came into the van, he took the drum from the other being, and he said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Who does it belong to?" And so I pointed to the drummer that was sitting in the passenger seat, and he gave me this dirty look, like, "Why did you have to point to me?" You know? And so the leader said to the other being, "Go and get him." And he went around to the side of the van, and he came back with the drummer. And the drummer I call Sam, and that's another pseudonym. So the leader handed him the drum, and he said, "Is this yours?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Is it damaged?" He was really concerned that it would be damaged. And Sam looked at it and he said, "No, it looks okay to me." And he put it down on the floor of the van. And then they made us line up on the side of the van, passenger side. And he was giving us instructions, and we could all hear him in our head. And he said, "We're going to go on the ship now." And he said, "I want you to turn to your left and face the back of the person in front of you." And he said, "I'm going to go in front, and my friend here is going to go in the back, and we're all going to move as one unit, and we're going up into the ship." And he said, "When we move," he said, "don't look left or right, keep facing the back of the person in front of you." And he said, "When we go on the ship, don't touch the hull." So we started moving as one unit. We weren't walking, we were just kind of floating. And the drummer was in front of me because he became one of the people that were going to be taken at that point, you know, when he came around to see if the drum was okay. So there were actually, it was myself, the bass player, the hitchhiker, and the drummer that were taken on board. The guitarist and his girlfriend, Anne-Marie, stayed in the van. And so I couldn't resist the temptation. I had to look to the left. And as soon as I looked to the left, we stopped. And when I faced ahead again, we kept going. And I thought, oh, that's how it works. So I looked to the right and we stopped again. And the being didn't turn around. He just waited. And then I looked straight ahead and we kept going again. And when we got to the doorway of the ship, there were stairs, but we didn't take the stairs. We just tilted it as one unit, and we floated up into the archway. And again, I couldn't resist the temptation to touch the hull. So I reached down, and just with the tip of my my ring finger on my left hand, I touched the hull just lightly, and it felt like aluminum, and it looked like it had been spot welded, you know, like it
Really?
looked, yeah, it looked like it was a metal surface, and it looked as though there were spot welds along it, you know, and I didn't know what spot welds were at that time until I eventually found out from my dad, because he did spot welding. He was a welder before he became a millwright. And so, anyway, as we were going on the ship, the drummer in front of me, he's a pretty tall guy, and the archway of the ship was made for these little guys mostly. And so he banged his head on the top of the archway, and immediately we stopped, and the being that was in front turned and he said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm okay." But you could see he wasn't happy to be there at all. But as soon as we went forward and we got inside, it was kind of dimly lit inside, and I couldn't tell where the source of light was coming from. It's just everything was lit. And immediately when we got inside, they separated us from each other. And I ended up with the leader, and they took us over to these benches that were kind of rounded, arched, that matched the contour of the ship. And we sat down on there, and he said, "I need you to remove all your garments and pile them in a pile on the floor." He said, "You'll be able to see them from where you are." And he said, he told me to put the bag of recorders on top of the clothing. And so I started getting undressed, and I could see that the hitchhiker was getting undressed, and the bass player. And I noticed that somebody had long underwear on. And for quite a while through the investigation, we didn't know who that was. But it turned out that it was the hitchhiker that had long underwear. And so anyway, I was down to my underwear, and I said, "Can I keep my underwear on?" And the being asked me, "What is underwear?" And so I pulled on the strap to show him, and he said, "Yes, you can keep that." So then he brought me over to the another area of the ship where there was a countertop with cupboards and drawers, kind of. And he asked me to get up on the countertop and sit there. So I did. I was sitting there in my underwear, and he walked over and he was talking to another being, and the other being had like a metallic tray that was tall, and there was a towel on it, and he was unrolling the towel, and there was all these instruments in there that looked like surgical instruments or dental instruments or something. And so while he was talking to that being, I thought, I've got to get something to take with me because nobody's going to believe this when I tell them. So I was looking around for something to take, and I wound up feeling one of the knobs on the drawer that was in the cabinet I was sitting on. And I thought, I wonder if this unscrews. So I started turning it, and it was getting looser and looser. So I realized this is threaded, and I managed to get it off. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with this thing now? I've got no pockets to put it in, and where am I going to put it? And I thought maybe I could hide it in my hide it in my armpit or something, you know. And for the time being, I just held it in my hand. And so then the leader came back over to me, and he said, "We're ready to do the test now." And then he kind of looked at me and he said, "What have you got?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You took something." And I realized then that you can't hide anything from these guys. They know what you're thinking. And so I showed him. I opened my hand and I showed him the knob. And he took it out of my hand, and he looked at it, and he said, "You can't keep this." And the other being that had the tray of instruments said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" And he looked at the other being and he said, "We're not supposed to let them keep anything." And so he took the thing and he put it in a place where I couldn't get to it. And then he brought this gurney over, like it looked like a metallic gurney, and he asked me to get on it. And so I made my way off the cabinet and I sat on the gurney, and he brought me over to where the other being was with the instruments. And he picked something up out of the instruments. It was like a little black box that looked about the size of a hand unit on a contemporary phone, you know. And he took this thing and he switched it on, and there was a green light that shone on the bottom of it. And he said, "I'm going to show you how this works." And he held his arm out, and he had, like, I don't know, I seem to remember it being like a lab coat or something on. And where he put this light, I could see through the coat, I could see through the skin in his arm, and I could see his skeletal structure under the skin. And I was amazed that this thing was like an X-ray device of some sort. So then he said, "Now I'd like to try it on you." And the first thing I asked was, "Is it going to hurt?" And he said, "No," but he said, "You might feel a kind of a tingling sensation." And so he said, "Would you hold out your arm?" And so I held out my right arm, and he put this light on my arm. And when he turned it on me, I could not only see the bones, but I could see all the veins and arteries, and I could see the muscles and everything in my arm. And I could even see my heartbeat pulsing in the veins. And I was surprised at how this thing worked. I'd never seen anything like that before. And he said, "Now we're going to take a look in your stomach with this thing." And he said, "I'd like you to lay down." And so I laid back on the cot, and I believe there were two other beings that joined him, the one with the instruments and another being. And the three of them were using this device, and they were looking inside my body. And I don't know what they were looking for, but they looked for a while, and I seem to remember a screen on the wall that was showing what was inside my stomach and stuff, but I couldn't see it very well because I was laying back. And so then they brought this other thing down that from the ceiling that looked like a bunch of concentric circles, and they were lights. And he said, "I want you to look into the center of that." And he turned it on, and the light started strobing toward the center. And I felt myself being hypnotized. And I didn't want to look at it. And I turned my head away, and he said, "No, keep looking at it. It's very important." And so I looked back at it again, and I looked into the center of it. And it only took a few seconds, and I was out like a light. And then when I woke up, I don't know how long I'd been out for, but they had done some kind of a procedure on me, and I don't know what it was. But there was no scarring and no blood or anything. They just had done something, and the one being was rolling the instruments up in the towel again. And he said to me, "You can go back to your clothes now." And so he started wheeling me back to where my clothes was. And the other guys were joining him. The only one that didn't cooperate was the drummer. And I remembered he was arguing with one of the beings that was trying to convince him to take his clothes off. And he just said, "No, I am not going to do that." And he argued and argued with this being. And the being finally gave up. He said, "Okay, but will you at least just stay here until the others are finished?" And he said, "Yes, I'll do that." And so he was still standing there with the being when they wheeled me back to my clothes. Mm-hmm. And we started getting dressed. And the being that had the instruments and the leader both came over to us, and they said, "We have a few moments now. If you want to ask us any questions, now is the time." And so they started with the other guys at the other end and moved toward me one at a time. And they were asking questions like, "Where are you from?" And I remember him saying, "Do you know anything about the stars?" And we said, "Well, not really." And there was like a star map on the wall. And he said, "Well, it probably won't mean anything to you then, but we're from this area here." And he pointed to some stars on the star map, which later I got a distinct feeling that he was pointing to the belt of Orion or somewhere in the constellation of Orion. And so the next guy, he said, that was the bass player, he said, "Do you have any bases on Earth?" And he said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, we have one right out here." And he pointed through the porthole to Lake Ontario. There were portholes around the perimeter of the ship as well, and the red lights were kind of underneath it. And the portholes were sort of recessed into the hull. And before I forget, I want to tell you about what happened to my finger where I touched the ship. About 2 weeks later, I got a huge planter's wart that grew on there. And I tried to get rid of it. I was putting free zone on it every day, and it lasted for weeks. And I finally got rid of it, but it took a long time. So the moral of the story is never touch the hull. You know, if they tell you not to, don't touch it. And so anyway, we were getting dressed, and it came to my turn to ask him a question. And so I'd been thinking while these guys were asking questions, I thought, well, these beings must get these kind of questions all the time. So I'm going to ask them something a little more profound. And so I asked him, "What is the true religion on Earth?" And that seemed to surprise them, you know. And they looked at each other, and then they looked at me, and he said, "Why would you ask us a question like that?" And I said, "Well, because you guys are obviously a lot more advanced than we are technologically and probably socially, and you're probably more advanced spiritually. So I figured if anybody would know what the true religion on Earth is, it would be you guys." And he seemed kind of surprised at that. And he said, "Are you in a religion now?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Is it the true religion?" He said, "No." He said, "There is no true religion on Earth." And then he said, "That's the end of the questions and answers." He said, "That's the end." And I said, "Well, wait a minute." I said, you can't just leave me hanging like that. I want, can you elaborate more?" And he said, "No." He said, "We probably told you too much already." And so then they brought us over to the door, and we didn't take that floating thing this time. We walked down the steps, and I let all the other guys go ahead of me. So I was the last one, and I was just about to go down the steps, and the leader put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Wait." He said, "I want to talk to you some more." And then as he was talking to me, I blacked out again. It was like I went under hypnosis spontaneously. And when I came to, I was standing in the parking lot looking up at the ship, and he was standing in the doorway, silhouetted in the doorway of the ship, with the light behind him. And it was dark, and I could make out these big black eyes staring at me, and he was telling me something. And it was something very emotional that it really moved me, whatever he was saying. And the only part I caught was, "And you would be a great help to all your friends and family in the future. And so I was trying to remember what he said, because what it felt like was, it's like waking up from a really good dream, and you're grasping at the dream, trying to pull it back, and it's gone. It's just disappeared. And I kept trying to remember and trying to remember. And he floated down onto the pavement and came over to me. And he said, wasn't there something you wanted to show me? And at that time, I remembered that when I brought my recorders with me in that bag, that if I had an opportunity, I was going to show them to him and show them how they worked and that. And I was so dazed. I said, "What?" And he said, "You wanted to show me something." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And so I handed him the bag of recorders, and he took the bag in his hand. And I said, "Here, let me open it." And I opened it up for him. And I took out the tenor recorder and put it together. And I played a little bit on it. And so this is the recorder that I put together. And I handed it to him after I played a couple of notes on it. And he did something strange. I didn't expect him to do this, but he took it like he was going to put it up to his mouth, but instead he put it up to his nostrils. And he blew into it, and he got a couple of sounds out of it. But I was really surprised that he did that, and I wondered why. And I didn't find out until years later, when QFORN did the investigation of my case. They told me about an alien autopsy that was done, that Leonard Stringfield had attended, and he's written some books on these alien autopsies. And in the book, he said that they had no digestive system, that the throat, the mouth stopped at the throat. It was just like a pocket. And they had one organ that did the job of the heart and the lungs and the liver. And so they could only breathe through their nose. And so that's why the being put the recorder up to his nose to play it, you know. So I thought that was really interesting when they showed me that. So this was the actual recorder that the being held. I handed it to him, and he held it. And so I'll show you a little bit about what it sounds like. Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember the actual song that you played for the Grey?
No, I probably just did a little improv. Like, I don't think I actually played a song.
Now, do you know if they were associated with the Rigel person? What's your gut feeling on that?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, because you said that Rigel, the Grey would,
Yeah.
because of your soul contract, they come at specific times in your life to check up on you. Now, since
Well,
it's strange that you saw them a few times when you were young, and then you got this episode that you're being abducted. Now they have to be related.
Yeah. Well, he was the leader.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know this until later on. I realized that all these abductions that I had, he was present in all of them.
Okay.
And so that's how he was keeping his end of the bargain when I said, if you come and visit me, then I'll go down to Earth. And so he was the leader, and he was the one that walked into my room when I was about 4 years old, and the Gollywog experience. And
Can you show us the figurine of Rigel that you showed me?
Yeah, I found a little model that I made of a gray, and this is it here.
Wow.
And I painted it with model paints.
Okay.
So,
It's so cute.
yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
That's cool, really. Now, were they like some of them? Were they naked, or were they all wearing body suits, skin tight?
They were all wearing these body suits that were kind of a navy blue or a little bit lighter blue than that, but they all had these uniforms. But on the ship, when my band was abducted, I remember that the being had like a lab coat on or something that I don't know if he put it over top of his uniform or what, but he was wearing what looked like a lab coat to me, you know.
Now, were they only grays on the ship, or did you see mantids or perhaps other types of ETs?
No, there may have been other beings on the ship, but I didn't get to see them. There was a big circular room in the center that I never got to see inside it. So they could have been behind the wall watching the whole time. I don't know.
Okay.
Uh,
Now, the thing I
no,
liked about your story is that when you did describe a bit the the event that you were on the table, and you described the handheld device, which turned out to be some sort of X-ray. But
yeah,
when you spoke at the experiencers gathering at the Alien Cosmic Expo, and I think in 2017, and
yeah,
when you started describing your handheld device, Susie Hansen, who's a well-known researcher and
right,
contactee from New Zealand, was there speaking at the event, and she helped with opening up the gathering, and she
yeah,
stood up and came to you, and she corroborated what you saw because she also saw the same technology that was used on the craft.
right.
And could you talk about that?
Yeah. She was a paid speaker that was coming on after the experiencer group, and I was the last person to speak. And my stories, excuse me, are a little bit long, so I never usually get a chance to finish them. They kick me off the stage about halfway through the story usually, and then people approach me after and ask me to tell the rest of the story sometimes. But anyway, Susie, she came up behind me, and she told the audience that she uh, was very surprised to hear me describing this object because she had also seen that same kind of technology being used on the ships during her experiences with them. And she was so excited to hear somebody else corroborate that part of her story that she took me aside after and she said, I wonder if you could do me a favor. She said, I'd like to do a little video of you describing that object. And if you'll let me do this little video of you, just a short one, I'll give you a copy of my book signed. And I was going to buy one anyway, so I said, sure. And so I did this little interview with her the next day. I found an area in the hotel where there was nobody there, and it was kind of in the back and nicely lit with windows all around, and there were comfortable chairs, and it was the perfect place to do this. So I let her film me describing the this piece of technology that allowed you to see under the skin. And I believe she still uses that film clip at conferences. She'll show it.
Really?
And so anyway, she gave me a signed copy of the book. And then later on, a friend of mine, Wanda Hewitt in Guelph, she sent me a commercial that surprised me just recently. And it was about a device very similar to this, that it was called the vein scanner. And it's a device that has just come out with our technology now, where they can shine this green light on your skin and it shows them where the veins are. And it's used to help nurses find veins when people have thin veins that are hard to find. And basically, I think how it works is it picks up the heat signature from the vein and reflects it back onto the skin, using the skin as a screen to show where the vein is. And so when she sent me this video clip of this new invention that I'd seen back in the early 70s, and it was only just recently invented, that's being used now. In fact, theirs were a lot more advanced, because you could not only see the vein, you could see the muscles and you could see the bones as well. But now we're only up to the point where we've got a vein scanner that shows you the veins under the skin. As soon as she sent me that, I sent it to Grant Cameron right away, because he's heard my story a couple of times, and I knew that he would see the significance of it right away. And he did. And so he did a video of both me and Susie Hansen talking about the vein scanner.
Wow. So one question comes to mind is, now where did they get the idea to create a vein scanner? So did they sort of, get it from alien tech that might have, been taken from the crash, the Roswell crash, or where did they find the, this, the ideas to get, to create that?
I can't really answer that because I don't know, but I can speculate. And I believe that a lot of the technology that they get, that these companies come out with, that is considered advanced technology, was reverse engineered from crashed alien craft. And what the government does, it has a lot of different contractor companies that work for the government, and they distribute this technology that they recover from craft ships to different companies. Mm-hmm. And they tell them, figure out how it works. And so they figure out how it works, and they get the patent on it, and then they release it as new technology.
That's right.
That's what I believe is happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so what happened after you got abducted? Everybody hopped on board the truck, the van. Did you talk about it?
Well, what happened was the leader that I was with, that I had kind of a bond with, like an emotional bond, he looked at me, and I felt this incredible feeling of love projecting from him. And I'd never felt that kind of love from anybody before in my life. And so the wind was blowing. It was cold. It was getting close to Christmas time, close to winter. Even though it was October, the party we played at, they had a Christmas tree, which surprised me that they had a tree in the middle of October. But some people kind of worship Christmas, I guess. And so anyway, my face was itching because it was cold and it was windy. And so I went to scratch my face, and I found out that it was soaking wet, that I'd been crying. And I didn't know why I had been crying, but it must have been at that point where he was downloading a message to me telepathically directly into my subconscious. And it felt like I was awakening from a dream, And And whatever that message was, it was very emotional. And so I felt this tremendous love coming from him. And then he said, would you like me to take you back to your vehicle? And I said, no, that's okay. And I said, am I going to see you again? And he said, oh, yes, you will see us again. And so I thanked him, and I turned around and I walked back to the van. And I came around the back of the van. The back doors were open. And I looked in, and everybody was inside, but they were all kind of suspended, like in a state of suspended animation. Nobody was moving. And as soon as I started to climb in, they all came to life. And I could see that I had come in the middle of a conversation that they'd been having. And they said, we all have agreed on something, and we need you to agree on it too. And I said, what's that? And he said, we're not going to tell anybody about this. And I said, what do you mean we're not going to tell anybody about this? I said, people need to know this stuff is happening. Of course we're going to talk about it. Of course we're going to tell them. And he said, no, we're all in agreement on this. And he said, we're not going to tell anybody about this. And he said, and if you tell anybody, we'll just deny it, and you'll look like a fool. And I was really upset. And I couldn't answer them. I couldn't say anything. I was so angry that they took that position. But I did notice that the hitchhiker was no longer with us. He wasn't with us for the rest of the ride home. And I wondered where he had gotten to. And I found out just recently, actually. But anyway, we watched the ship leave, and it started moving off toward Lake Ontario. And we watched it getting smaller and smaller. And while it was moving away, I kept hearing this voice in my head telling me, you're going to forget that this ever happened. And I was having a mental argument with this voice saying, no way, I am not going to forget this. I'm going to remember this for the rest of my life. And they kept telling me, you're going to forget, you're going to forget. So when we got home, when they dropped me off at my house, my parents were in bed, and it was very late. I'm guessing somewhere around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And I came in and I went into the kitchen, made myself a sandwich, and I took out a writing pad and a pencil, and I wrote down in point form everything that I could remember about the incident. And then I tore the paper off, put it in the top drawer of my dresser, and went to bed. And the next morning, all memory of the incident was gone. And the paper, I never found it again until several years later. But I did find out what happened to the hitchhiker. And that's kind of a strange story in itself, because what happened was when I did the video with Mitch Fillion from Near Death Experiment, that got over 2.2 million views. That guy that we picked up at the party that night to give a ride back to St. Catharines happened to see that video.
No.
And when he saw it, and I was talking about the part where the being got his foot caught in the snare drum stand and knocked it over, he said, that's when I stood up. And he said, I had to contact you and tell you that I was that person. And he said, I was drunk that night. And he said, I actually positioned the drum stand that way to see if the alien would actually trip over it. And he did. And he was a bit obnoxious that night, this guy. I said, well, how do I know this is you? I said, first of all, were you wearing long underwear that night? And he said, yes, I was. He said, my friend was supposed to come to the party, and he told me that they were going to have a bonfire out in the back, and that it might be cold, so he suggested that I wear long underwear. So that answered that question. And so then I said, well, what happened to you after the incident? I said, where did you go? You disappeared. And he said, well, actually, I stayed on the ship. And I said, you're kidding. And he said, no. And he said, the beings dropped me off. And I said, why? And he said, well, because he said, I was trying to pick up your guitarist girlfriend, Anne Marie. And he said, your guitarist was getting pretty mad at me. And he started describing the conversation that we had in the back of the van. And as he was telling me these things, I was remembering them. And I had never told anybody about him trying to pick up Anne Marie, and I never told anybody about the conversation we had, because I didn't actually remember it myself until he told me. And then I started remembering those pieces of the incident that he told me about. So I knew he totally confirmed that it was him, that he was the hitchhiker. And he's a little older than me now. And so immediately I tried to get friend him on Facebook. I wanted to send him a friend request and stay in contact with this guy, because he's one of the few remaining people that can verify my story. And so I went to his Facebook page. There was no profile, just no profile picture, just the standard shape of a male head. Mm-hmm. And no timeline, no friends list, nothing. It was a completely blank profile. And so I sent him a friend request, and he never granted it. But I had some future conversations with this guy, which I kept, I made copies of. I copied and pasted the text from our conversation and put it into a Word file for later use, because I wanted to use it in my book, which I have used some parts of it, but there's some parts I haven't mentioned. Like he'd had other experiences with these beings before. And I thought that he was a plant. I said, were you planted on us specifically for the purpose of opening the back doors? And he said, no. He said, I wasn't planted on you. He said, I was really there at the party. My friend didn't show up, and I had nothing to do, and they kept giving me drinks. And so he said, I got drunk. And he said, I was kind of obnoxious. And I said, well, what on earth would ever make you want to open up the back door? And he said, I could hear them. He said, I could hear them in my head. They were asking me, would you open the door, please? Please open the door. Please open the door. And they kept working on him. And because he was drunk, he just finally gave in and he opened the door. And that's how they got in. And so anyway, this guy is quite the character. He told me to use the pseudonym Alexander for his name if I use it in the book. But I have his real name. And I said, well, what happened when you stayed on the ship? And he said, I think they took me out to Lake Ontario and they showed me their base under the water. And then they took me home. And he said, they dropped me off at my house. He lived in an area on the end of Geneva Street, which was also along the southern shore of Lake Ontario. And he lived in a house near there, and they dropped him off. And some of the neighbors apparently became aware of the ship. They could see the lights through the windows, and they spotted the ship. And when they dropped him off, and he had an argument with one of the beings, and they weren't too pleased with him. So they just kind of pushed him off when they got to his house and took off. And so he said that the neighbors were talking about this, and his dad had told the neighbors that, yeah, my son was abducted and all this, and it kind of got out. And a short time after that, he said a black limousine pulled up in front of my house. And he said it was unlike any car I've ever seen before, but it was a big black limousine with no markings, no company logo on it, just, and the windows were all blacked out. And he said 2 guys got out of it, and they're tough looking guys. And they came over and they threatened him and his father. And they told him not to talk about UFOs anymore. Don't spread this story around. Don't tell anybody what you saw, or there's going to be trouble. And he said, well, if I want to talk about it, I'll talk about it. And he actually got a bit rough with him. He told me that. And they twisted his arm until he agreed to not say anything. And then they let him go and they left. So that's a part of the story I never found out until the hitchhiker contacted me.
Did he describe how they looked like? What they were wearing? Were they military? Were they MAB?
He said he felt they were G-men, like government men.
Okay.
But they were, they kind of matched the typical description of Men in Black, you know.
Wow. Did you ever keep the notepad, the paper that you wrote down on, just, the reminder?
Yes, I have it.
Really?
I found it, I'm not sure when I actually found it, but it was years later. And it's I have a briefcase with notes about my case and the 2 journals that published the case back in 1981. It was published in the Canadian UFO Research Network's journal, QFORN.
Okay.
And it was published in the MUFON journal back then. Back then, MUFON had kind of a cheaply made booklet that they put out every month. And it wasn't like the nice quality ones they've got now, but it had a yellow cover and just a black ink picture on the front. And so I have the proof. I have those 2 journals. And it was also published by Flying Saucer Review. And that's available on the internet.
Okay.
I can give you the link to it later if you want to write it into the description or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
I believe another gray-oriented event happened on a few years later.
Yeah, with the same band. We had a gig at Brock University at the Brock pub in the back of the university. There was a pub called Alfie's Trough, and my band had a gig there. And this was a weird experience. I've already done a video of it with Mitch Fillion at the Alien Cosmic Expo. It's about 20 minutes long, and it's on YouTube. And basically what happened was we arrived to play this gig, and we had this wooden dolly with wheels and a rope to pull it. And we pile all our stuff on there, all the equipment and the drums, mostly, and the amplifiers. And so we went in the front door of Brock University, and there was a long hallway that went to the back of the university. Now, since then, there's been a lot of renovations to the university. There was a big open area that was outside, and it's now closed in. But anyway, we went, as we were going down the hallway toward the back, I saw 2 gray beings walking by. And I pointed out to the band, I said, look, there's like a couple of aliens or something down the hallway there. And that's where we were headed. And they said, yeah, it does look, they did look kind of weird, eh? And so we still continued. And one of them went into a classroom at the end of the hallway. I saw him open the door and go in. And I thought to myself, when we get down there, I'm going to open that door and take a look in and see if I see him. And I'd been through Brock many times before, and I knew that that classroom was a place where I'd seen a play once before. It was kind of like an amphitheater that goes down and there's a stage in there. And so when we got there, I opened the door and I looked in and it was pitch black. The lights were all out. It was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything. So I shut the door, and as soon as we went around the corner, they were there. And there was, I think, 4 of them. And Anne-Marie let out a scream, and they immediately came over to each one of them, and they separated us from one another again. And this seems to be part of the protocol that they use when they abduct humans, and they separate them. And it's something that our police often do that as well. It's I guess an interrogation technique or whatever. And so the being that was with me, he said, "Where are you people going?" And I said, "Well, we're a band and we're playing at the pub out here in the back." And I could hear the others telling them the same thing, that we had to play at this. And the being said to me, "Is this something you're being paid for?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well," he said, he turned to the other beings and he said, "We have to let them go. They'll be missed." So they told us, they took us to the door where we were going out with the instruments and the dolly. And they said, "You're going to forget everything. As soon as you get out that door, you'll forget that this ever happened." And so sure enough, as soon as we opened up the door and we pulled the dolly out and we started walking toward the pub, we'd forgot completely about it. It was wiped from our memory. And so when we got to the pub, there was kind of some wooden stairway and ramps that they had built there for the pub. And I looked over the railing, and Anne-Marie was standing there with me, and I said, and I saw one of these beings. I saw him walking around the corner, and I could see the top of his bald head and as he went by. And I said to Anne-Marie, "Look at that." And she looked, and I said, "It's an alien or something." And she said, "Yeah, it does look kind of weird." And then he disappeared. And we'd been banging on the door of the pub, and at that point they opened the door of the pub, and that was the last we thought about it at that time. So we went in, and we set up our instruments, and the guitarist, after we unloaded everything, he took the dolly back to his van, and then he came back. Now, I don't know what happened to him, if anything happened to him during that time, but anyway, we set up our instruments, and it was a Saturday night, and we were waiting and nobody was showing up. So we played a set basically just for the bartenders because nobody was there. And when we finished the set, we sat down and had a couple of draft, and the bartender came over, and we said, "When does the crowd usually arrive?" And he said, "Well, this is one of the busiest nights of the week." And he says, "I have no idea, but," he said, "the place should be packed by now." And there was nobody there. And so we got back up and we played another set because we were paid to play there. And we played another set basically just for the bartenders again. Excuse me. And still nobody showed up. So the evening was wearing on, and the bartender came back over to our table and he said, he says, I have no idea what's going on. He said, this is supposed to be our busiest night every week. It's jam-packed. And he said, did you guys do something to piss off your audience or something? Because, you know, and we said, no. And he said, well, I don't understand why nobody's here. So he said, I'm going to pay you for showing up and playing, but you might as well pack up your stuff and go because it looks like nobody's coming. And we said, okay. And so the guitarist, Tom, he handed me his keys and he said, can you go back to the van and get the dolly and bring it so we can load everything up? And in the meantime, we'll wind up all the cords and stuff. And I said, okay. So I left with his keys and I went back in that back door into the back of Brock University. And there was nobody in the hallways. Nobody was there. And I'd had a couple of drafts and I needed to use the washroom. So I followed this one hallway off to the side because I knew there would be a bathroom down there somewhere. And I walked down the hallway, and as soon as I turned the corner, I saw all these people, like about 250 people or something, all lined up in the hallway. And they were all just standing there. Nobody was talking to each other. They were just standing and waiting. And I found that really strange. And so I went into the washroom and I came out and I walked up to this woman that was standing there in the lineup. And I said, can I ask you, what are you all doing standing here in the lineup like this? And she said, well, the men told us to stand here. And I said, what men? And she said, there's some men that they come and they take a few of us at a time. And I looked at her and all of a sudden I came to this realization that this was our audience. And they were all standing here in the hallway. And that's why nobody showed up at the bar, because these beings or somebody told them to stand there in the hallway. So at that point, one of the beings came in through the back door, and he'd seen me standing there out of the lineup talking to this woman. And he said, hey, you there? And I said, what? And he said, you were told to stand in the lineup and not talk to each other. And I said, no. I said, you don't understand. I'm not part of this. And at that point, he looked like a human being to me. And I didn't really notice that he was speaking to me telepathically until later on. But he said, well, stand there with them now. And I said, I can't. I said, I've got to go and get the dolly and bring it to the bar so we can load our equipment up. And he said, well, I need you to stand in that lineup. And I argued with him, and he realized he wasn't getting anywhere with me. And so he said, well, then come with me right now then. He said, I'll take you right now. And I said, well, if it doesn't take too long, because I've got to go and get the dolly. And so I went with him, and he took me outside, and it was wintertime, and the ground was covered with about 5 or 6 inches of snow. And in the snow, I could see hundreds of footprints all going in a line to the back of the building. And then they went around the corner and disappeared. So I was wondering what was going on. And then I was looking at this being that was walking with me, and he was beginning to look less and less human and more like a gray. And I thought, this is really weird. Something strange is going on here. And so I followed him because I was curious as to where all these footprints were leading. And we went around the corner. And as soon as we got around the corner, there was this big saucer-shaped craft again sitting on the pavement behind the university. And you couldn't see it from until you get around the corner. And there it was sitting in this paved section. And there was a ramp going up, and the door was open. And he started to take me up this ramp. And this woman came to the doorway, and she was dressed in like a Red Cross outfit, like a nurse. And he said to her, "Can you take this guy now? Because he's got to go somewhere." And she said, "No, I can't take him now. I've got too many people in here as it is." And he said, "Well, he has to leave, and he'll be missed. Like, can you not just take him now?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, what do you want me to do with him?" She says, "I don't know. Take him where he's got to go." So the being took me back. He said, "Where do you need to go?" And I said, "Well, I need to go back to the bar now because the guys are going to wonder where the heck I got to." And so we knew the bar was down the road there. And so he walked with me uh, until we got back to the bar. And I saw the van parked a little further down at a different doorway that came out of the back of the university. And the guys were loading up the equipment into the van. And so I said, "They're going to be really pissed at me." I said, "Can you come with me and explain what happened, why I didn't come back with the dolly?" And he said, "No, I can't do that. They need me. I have to go." And I said, "Well, can you at least stand there by the tree so I can point to you and tell them what happened?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I can do that." And so he went and he stood over by this tree that was on the other side of the fence. And I walked over to the guys, and my last name is Boucher, but my nickname was Boucher. So my friends always used to call me Boucher back then. And they said, "Boucher, where the hell were you? We've been looking all over for you." And I said, "Well, I was with this guy over here." And they said, "What guy?" And I said, "The guy over there by the tree." And as I was pointing to him, I noticed he was vanishing. He was just disappearing. And so they said, "There's nobody there." And they said, "What are you telling us a story like that for? That's pretty lame." And I said, "No, it was an alien." And they said, "Oh, Boucher, give me a break." And they said, "If we hadn't had another set of keys hidden on the van, we wouldn't have been able to get in. And we were going to leave without you because we didn't know where you were." And so they were really mad at me. And I got in, and they packed up my stuff for me and everything. And they didn't want to talk to me. They were just really, really mad at me. And I couldn't explain to them. They didn't want to listen. They just, you know. So anyway, I'm hoping that somebody that was at Brock University that night will remember this, because our whole audience was lined up in that hallway. And somebody out of that many people has got to remember this. And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that they'll contact me and
Well,
corroborate.
if they do, they could always use the the YouTube channel email, get into contact with me, and I'll get into contact with you, and you can sort things out after that.
Yeah, or they can find me on Facebook
Also, yeah.
under my name, Steve Boucher. And you can also type my name into the search engine on YouTube, and all my videos will come up.
At the end of the video, I could link one. I'll link the near-death experiment interview, so they could have that one too.
Yeah, that's the one that has over 2.2 million views now.
Yeah. Now you've got a book coming out called Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall.
Right, correct.
So,
I've been working on it for collectively about 3 years now. And it's in the final proofreading stages right now. It's ready to be published. And the fellow that is proofreading it for me is a Harvard graduate with a degree in English literature. And he's a friend of mine. And so I felt that he was the perfect person to do the proofreading and editing.
Also, Grant Cameron's the one that's done the foreword for the book.
Yeah, he did the foreword for my book, and I'm also publishing it through his company.
Okay.
I think it's called It's All Connected.
Okay. So as soon as it's out, I'll be able to add the link. Do you know if it's going to be available on Amazon? Or
Yeah, we're publishing it on Amazon.
okay.
So I'm thinking maybe a couple of months, maybe around September, I'll be ready to publish it.
Okay. Well, as soon as it's out, I'll add the link to the description. So people watching this could always have a look and purchase it.
Yep, that
And
sounds good.
so I think we're good. Quick question: growing up, did you have any supernatural stuff happen to you when you're on your own?
I have had a bit of supernatural stuff happen. I saw a ghost once when I was a teenager, and that's another story. It would take a little while to explain it all.
Yeah. But these things do tend to associate together. Contactees and the supernatural. It's all connected. So that's a question I like to ask to people because they normally do. I had loads of stuff happen to me, and other than the ET stuff. So it's one and the same really. So let's call it a night.
Okay.
We've been at this for at least 2 hours, so that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So Steve, thanks for coming on. It's been a blast. Enjoy this because you got into certain stories that you never had to get into when we were together at the the conferences. So many thanks. And to those watching, hope you enjoyed the tonight's show. More experience interviews coming up, and I'll see you guys next time. So take care, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, Steve.
Okay.